Our theme music, and let everybody in.
Tell me of another taco and I smoke that. Wait, you're not gonna get a kick.
Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Masters of the Air series with Glenn Flickinger. I am not Glenn Flickinger. I'm Todd DiPastino. I'm the director of the Veterans Breakfast Club. When I'm flying solo I'm not as good of a wingman as Sean Hall is, so I forgot to do a few things, but I think we've got it corrected now. I want to welcome everybody to this special program here that we're doing on a session of Thursday evenings. Glenn Flickinger, who knows more about World War II than anybody I know, is hosts a program covering the Masters of the Air Apple Plus TV series that just debuted last week. He's doing this on behalf of the Veterans Breakfast Club. Glenn serves on the board of the Veterans Breakfast Club. I'm the executive director and founder of the Veterans Breakfast Club. We've been around since 2008. And for those of you who haven't joined us before, our mission is to hold events like this where veterans can share their stories with the public. We want people to connect. We want people to heal. We want people to be educated and inspired through our programs. And that's why we hold these storytelling events. We hold them live in person, live online. We have a podcast. We have publications like our quarterly VBC magazine, which I will talk about later this evening. And you can learn more about what we do, the programs we offer, and become a member at our website, which is veteransbreakfastclub.org. That's veteransbreakfastclub.org. Tonight, as you know, we are so privileged to have John Luckadoo, one of the most remarkable human beings I've ever had the pleasure of interacting with on Zoom. And also we have biographer, writer Kevin Maurer with us. Thank you both so much for joining us. We have sponsors for this program, Tobacco Free Adagio Health and UPMC for Life are both generous supporters and underwriters of our programming. And I'll talk a little bit more about them later in our program. But I want to get right into our story and throw it to Glenn Flickinger. Glenn, thank you for joining us tonight.
My pleasure. It's really been fun doing these first few shows. And now we get the opportunity to talk about Masters of the Air after having seen, at least some of us. Not everybody I know has the ability to watch it on Apple TV. And we've sort of set up these programs that you don't have to have seen it in order to participate in the program. But, you know, having those first two programs aired was pretty fascinating. I've watched each of them twice now. And of course, we have a very special guest tonight, as Todd mentioned, and that's John Luckadoo. John, please say hello.
Well, thank you. I'm so delighted to be with you.
John, it's a pleasure to have you. We also have the author of Damn Lucky, the biography of Luckadoo, and that's Kevin Maurer. Kevin, please say hello, Kevin.
Hey, guys. How are you?
Kevin was with us last week when we had a panel of World War II Air War historians, experts, authors, and so forth. So Kevin's been very generous with his time. Thank you so much.
No, my pleasure.
If most of you might recall, many of you may not from, this was 2 years ago, the first time we had Kevin and John Luckadoo on, and we went through the book, Damn Lucky, which at that point had only been out, I think, a couple of 3 months, and went through all of John's life in detail, his World War II experiences and so forth. And we're going to be touching on all those again tonight, but we're not going to go through that same material 100%. We'll hit the highlights of it. I've listened to just about every interview Lucky has done, and he's He's a fascinating man with a lot of knowledge. And after all, he was there. He's the only one we have on the program who was there with the 100th Bomb Group. But we do have some other World War II veterans on tonight that I want to recognize. I see Ed Cottrell. Ed, can you wave your hand? And okay. Can we unmute him for a second, Todd?
We most certainly can. Hello, Ed, who just celebrated his 102nd birthday.
We had a party with 75 people up at the party a couple of Saturdays ago.
Oh man, what an event that was, and what a person he is. Another one of these remarkable human beings.
For those of you who don't know Ed's story, we've had him on as well. And Ed was a P-47 pilot out of actually the 9th Air Force later in the war, late 44 and 45. And as the program unfolds, I'm thinking we'll have Ed on as a guest again later in the series as the chronology of this plays out, right? And then I think we saw Joe Peterburs as well.
Yes, we did. Hey, Joe.
Hey, hey,
There he is.
how you
Hi,
doing?
Joe. Thank you, Joe, for being on.
Hey, it's interesting.
Well, you're interesting, Joe. You were there as well. Joe was a P-51 Mustang pilot, again, in the second half of 44 and 45, as I recall. And we had his remarkable story on as well. I can't remember, 18 months or 2 years ago. Again, a little bit later in our programming, as the episodes play out, we'll be bringing you in to tell some of your story and your reactions as well. Okay. Is Julian on tonight? Julia, I'm sorry.
Julie, I do not see Julia. Not yet. Not yet. Well, I'll keep an eye out for her, though.
Okay. Okay. Julia is our Pittsburgh resident. She's 103.
Turning 103 March 2nd.
Right. And was a World War II code breaker. So
yes, sharp as ever.
Sharp as ever. Yeah.
She wanted to sign up for a code breaking class at the University of Pittsburgh, but couldn't figure out how she'd get to campus for class 3 times a week. So she didn't take the class. That's the only reason.
Too bad we didn't know that. We could have figured that out.
Oh, I told her that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I see a couple other people I want to recognize before we get started, just because they've been so generous with their time. Colin Heaton, say hello, please, or wave at least.
Hello, Colin. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, everybody.
There we go.
Colin, how many World War II vets have you interviewed?
About 300, I think.
Man.
Wow. Both German, British, American,
Russian, South African, Australian, French, Belgian.
There you go. There you go. And he's written half a dozen books. And he was on our panel last week, and he's going to be on in the future, one of these episodes in the next 3 or 4 weeks, as well as sort of the featured expert for the night, if you will.
Hey, and I'm going to call out Rona Simmons too. Good to see you, Rona, from Georgia. Thank you so much. She's a wonderful writer, and she's an Army brat, and she's written. Oh, I'm sorry, Air Force brat, military brat. She's a military brat, and she's written a wonderful article about what it's like to grow up as a military brat. And she interviewed several others, and this is going to be in our next magazine. She's also an expert and a historian and writer in her own right. You have a book coming out with a great concept on one day in World War II.
Oh,
That's correct. I'm looking forward to it probably later this year, but it is the day that more people died than on any other day in World War II. And I'm going to challenge anyone to let me know what day they think that was.
Just a fantastic concept. So thank you, Rona, for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm going to have to start thinking about that one.
That's right.
Keep me up all night. Okay. I think we've recognized the people we want to. Let's get started. So, Todd, we're going to start with the survey, correct?
Got it.
So we're going to ask everybody to take a look at this very simple 3-question survey about Masters of the Air. You just go in and you yes or no, thumbs up or down, or somewhere in the middle. And then at the very bottom, any comments. Okay. I've already taken it. I won't reveal my answers. Does everybody see it? Everybody okay with it?
We're all good with it, Glenn. You go ahead and I will monitor the poll.
Okay. So here's how I thought we'd structure this program, given that we've seen the first two episodes. One of the thoughts we've had, Todd and I and Sean have had, is to make this program a little bit about what the Masters of the Air television series does not talk about, okay? Because the war is a huge war. The air war itself is a huge war. In a dramatic series like that, they can't mention every name. Every character can't be there. There were tens of thousands of airmen, hundreds of thousands of people in the 8th Air Force. It's impossible. They have to focus on, as they have, on one group. In this case, the 100th Bomber Group. In the Band of Brothers, it was Easy Company. In the Pacific, it was the 1st Division, right? So, but it seems like whenever they make these kind of programs, it's hard to put it all into context. And for people like most of us, but some of you perhaps not, that aren't World War II aficionados who either didn't live through it, like some of the men on our program tonight, or just haven't read enough or understood enough, I thought it would be good to try to put some of it in context. And I'm getting this partly from the commentary I've seen written. So, Todd, I'm going to try to bring this PowerPoint up, and you tell me when I have, I didn't share my screen, Todd. Darn. Okay, back to share screen here. Todd, I'm not doing this right, am I?
No, you're not. Click the green button, share screen at the bottom.
Yeah.
And then what do you see?
Well, so I want to share. Okay, let me share this. You're probably seeing now your own pictures. Now I can bring up the PowerPoint, I think.
Okay. Yeah, now we're seeing your desktop. Okay.
Okay. Let me get this correctly positioned, if I can.
Yeah, this is always the hardest part of the
There we go.
whole operation.
And particularly with a neophyte technical person like me. As I've told my son many times, who is a professional IT guy, about the only thing I can really do is spell IT. There we go. Okay, so the episode begins in July, I think it is, of 1943, when the 100th Bomb Group is initially assigned to Thorpe Rapids, and it shows them arriving, and it shows them then on their first couple of missions, right? Well, why are they even there? Why are we even having a strategic bombing campaign over Europe? What is strategic bombing? Where did that concept come from, right? Why did it make sense for all these young men to sacrifice themselves so readily in 1942 and 1943 and beyond, right? So the story goes back to what is called the Bomber Mafia. And I don't think they use that term in the program. We've all heard it before many times. It's mentioned in the book Masters of the Air by Don Miller. There's 4 or 5 pages on it. And then Malcolm Gladwell, who's an author I just really love, all his books, he came out with this book a few years ago, which went into much greater depth on it. And so I started to think a little bit about it, and I started to wonder, what a sort of pejorative term. Where'd that even come from? Well, why would somebody call someone else part of the mafia, right? It's a pretty negative thought. And it goes back to the 1930s. And in the 1930s, there was the U.S. Army Air Corps, not the U.S. Army Air Forces yet, the U.S. Army Air Corps. And there were a series of men, this being one of them, Lieutenant General Frank Andrews, okay, who were the strategists, and there were many others. I can't put all of them up even in this little PowerPoint because there's a dozen or so, who were the strategists behind developing an offensive Air Force capability. The traditional Army guys, the ground force guys, the artillery guys, wanted the Air Force just to be a defender of America, a defender of our coastlines, and to be a tactical Air Force that just helped the ground forces, take out that bunker over there, take out, these troops marshaling over there, that sort of thing. This man, Lieutenant General Frank Andrews, who you see, I won't repeat all those things, those bullet points that are there, was one of the men who was saying, no, we need a strategic Air Force. We need to develop our concepts of strategic bombing. And they were all down at this Maxwell Air Force Base that we've heard so much about. This man was a fascinating man. I've not read a lot about him. As I read more and more about him, I was more and more fascinated with him. He actually was thought by Marshall to be potentially the supreme Allied commander in Europe at one time. Had he lived, it was possible that could have been him instead of Eisenhower. At least that was discussed at some length. Unfortunately, he was killed in a 1943 plane crash in Iceland. The next man, and I don't know, Lucky, if this is a man you remember, heard, is General Hayward Hansel, who was a much younger man in the 30s. He was a very strong proponent of precision bombing, precision daylight bombing. And he clearly was one of the key players in the Bomber Mafia, right? He even was the author in 1940 and 1941. He was in the Army Air Force Air Plans Division in 41, once it was called the Army Air Force. He was the key author of the first airplane strategic policy written by him and a couple of others. War Plan 1 and then War Plan 2, I think they were called. In 1942, he goes to England, of course, with the 8th Air Force. He's more of a staff officer at first. Eventually, he becomes a wing commander early on in the story of the 8th Air Force. And then eventually and you'll see the story unfold here, he and LeMay clash over what sort of bombing methodology should take place. They clash in late 1942 and early 1943. So all of this came out of the desire to avoid what happened in World War I, where millions and millions of men faced off each other in the trenches. And I know World War II was terrible. World War I, even just as terrible, right? And the British lost 1 million men. I think our killed in action was 67,000, 65,000, something like that. The French lost 1 million men. The Germans lost a couple million men, all from this static warfare that occurred. And the idea of strategic bombing was with precision bombing, we could take out the economic infrastructure of the enemy, take out their oil facilities, take out their key industrial facilities, take out their electrical facilities, their transportation facilities, et cetera, and avoid the mauling, avoid the extreme number of casualties that occurred in World War I. So this Bomber Mafia came together. They began developing these concepts. And one of the first things that came about was the Norden bombsight, which was developed actually in the beginning to be developed in the 1920s, developed by a Dutch engineer who came to the United States, worked for the old gyroscope company, and developed the bombsight in the 20s and early 30s. And it was revolutionary at the time. It was sort of what we think of today as a computer, only not a digital computer, a simple computer that could precisely drop bombs. And this was, wow, the mafia, the Bomber Mafia says, this is it. This is what gives us the precision at the time. It was tried out in the deserts of Arizona, and that's where they came up with that story, or that phrase we've heard many times. You could put a bomb in a picker ball using this thing. Well, you could in Arizona on a sunny day from 10,000 feet with nobody shooting at you, but that became more apparent later, right? And then the second thing that came about in 1937 was this baby, And I'm sure Lucky recognizes this, right? This was one of the early, in fact, I think this was the B-17 299. Yes, that was one of the prototypes, first flown in 1937. All right.
I think it was actually 1935, Glenn.
You're right, Lucky. Flown in 1935.
The 199 was conceived and developed and eventually became the B-17E, or the A and the B, with that very forked tail. The big vertical stabilizer. I'll try to get
this back here.
That marked the, yes, that was one of the most distinguishing features about it, because it afforded a tremendous amount of stability to the aircraft at whatever altitude it was flying, and particularly at high altitude.
So you're right, Lucky. It was 35. I think it was his first test flight. In 1937, the U.S. Army Air Corps made its first order, and they ordered 17 of them, which seems kind of ridiculous to think about it now, but it was the interwar years, still the Depression, not much of a budget, and they ordered 17 of them, soon to be followed by many thousands. But this then, the combination of the Norden bomb sight and this, the first time there was a 4-engine heavy bomber, and the thought was it could fly faster at that time than any fighter plane, which were then called pursuit planes. It could fly as much as 250 miles an hour, Lucky, to have that about right. And then eventually faster.
Exaggeration. Of course, the higher altitude did add some to its airspeed, but indicated it was only 140 to 150 miles per hour.
But still, the concept was we didn't need to develop fighters because these would go faster and higher than the fighters could go. And that was correct in the mid and late 1930s. Not so correct come 1942 and 3. Okay. But I'm just trying to explain that, these men were not stupid. They were very smart men. They were developing a concept that they thought was workable and that they would be able to put it into place. And these are some of the men that were involved in it. On the left is Ira Aker, who becomes the first commander of the 8th Air Force in January of 1942 when it's created. And then they go to England in May, June, spring of 1942. Arrives with just a staff, virtually no planes, no resources, whatever, but the RAF. On the right side is Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris, they call him. He was the head of Bomber Command for the RAF. And they were willing to have the Americans come. They know they needed our resources. They helped with the bases, et cetera, et cetera. And then in the middle is Carl Spaatz, who was more senior than Aker, commander, various very, very high command levels over time, excuse me. Okay. So, and those two men also were devoted to the doctrine of daylight precision bombing. The British already at this time in 1942 had moved 100% to night bombing and what was referred to as carpet bombing or city bombing, more pejoratively as terror bombing, right? Just go hit a city. Don't, just try to hit 100 square mile or 50 square mile area. Don't worry about hitting a specific railroad or a specific plant or a specific target of some kind. Okay. So
sometimes called strategic bombing or saturation bombing.
Saturation bomb, another word for it. Okay. So two very different theories in 1942, right?
Yeah.
This is one of my favorite people in World War II, Captain Paul Tibbets. Captain Paul Tibbets flies the first mission of the 8th Air Force on August the 17th, 1942. He flies it to, I believe it's Rouen, pronounced Rouen, to marshalling yard, railroad yards, April 17th, 1942, with 17 bombers, 17 B-17s. highly successful raid. The accuracy was very. I'm not sure why my my computer is jumping like that. Forgive me. So what I find fascinating about Paul Tibbets is almost exactly 3 years later, he drops the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. In 3 years, we go from 17 bombers scratching together 17 bombers to fly a couple hundred miles into France. And in 3 years, we have B-29s, twice the size or much bigger than the B-17s and 24s, dropping atomic bombs on Japan. And this is the man that did it. And if you ever get a chance to read some of his biographies and so forth, he's a fascinating man. Lived in Columbus, Ohio, most of his life, and lived quite a long life, as I recall, too. Right. But the 8th Air Force in 1942 did not penetrate Germany. There's some fascinating facts you can find online. Colin Heaton knows all of these by heart. I found them this week. You can find a website online that goes through every mission with every date and all the details about each of the missions of the 8th Air Force, year by year, month by month. How many planes went out, what type planes went out, where they went, how many were shot down, how many men were injured, that sort of thing. In 1942, we lost 43 planes on, I think I have that right here, on, geez, I thought I had the number of missions. I believe it was 20 odd missions. Colin, do you have that number in your head?
Not in my head. I've got
here,
Roger.
Here it is, 27 missions. On 27 missions, we lost 43 planes, all of them to France or none of them into Germany, most of them to the submarine docks in Saint-Nazaire, France. They tried to bomb the submarine pens. I'm sorry, I stepped on you there.
No, you're absolutely right. It was Saint-Nazaire and Lorient.
Okay, yeah. So you can see that what was happening to the 8th Air Force at that time was a very gradual buildup of planes and pilots and so forth, right? Behind it is this long line of American production beginning to gear up, but also this long line, which Lucky was in, of pilots and co-pilots and navigators and bombardiers and the crew being put through training. Right? It just doesn't happen instantly. It was going to take a long time. And then what happened in November of 1942 that dramatically impacted the 8th Air Force was the invasion of North Africa on November 8th. Right? And what that did was take resources that were supposed to go to the 8th Air Force and instead went to the Mediterranean. If I'm not mistaken, even some of the bomber group or two that were already in England were directed to North Africa. So it was a very slow buildup in 1942, well before the 100th got there in 1943, which I'm trying to build up to. This man arrives in October of 1942 as the commanding officer of the 305th Bomb Group, Curtis LeMay, who is mentioned several times in the episodes, right? Kind of like, hey, we better fix ourselves up. We better get everything in order before LeMay gets here. LeMay is going to come down on us hard. Lucky, did you ever have the chance to meet LeMay? I think I've heard a couple of your programs where you've mentioned LeMay.
Well, I certainly did meet him, and actually he pinned my DFC on me when I completed my missions. So I had great respect for Curtis LeMay, and I think he was grossly underused and would have been better advanced and given more superior and senior authority because he analyzed very carefully the opposition that we were facing, and he developed a method of our resisting the attacks of the Luftwaffe upon us because of that analysis. He also led some of the most dangerous and toughest missions that we had, most notably the one to Regensburg, where instead of returning to England after bombing the target, since it was so deep into Germany, they proceeded to fly to North Africa, where they refueled and rearmed and flew another mission coming back rather than flying back to England.
Yeah.
And that supposedly would have completely thrown the Luftwaffe off. I think it may have for maybe 20 seconds, but it didn't really change the complexion of the war all that much. But our losses during that mission were pretty horrendous. And it was also on that mission that the Bloody Hundredth got its reputation, or part of its reputation, as the Bloody Hundredth, because as you may remember, Glenn, it was reputed or alleged that one of our bombers, piloted by Captain Knox, on that mission, instead of observing the unwritten law of the sky, where if we were unable to return to England and we knew it, we could lower our wheels and thereby signal to the opposing forces that we were surrendering, whereupon a couple of fighters would escort us to the nearest airdrome and we would be landed and then captured and made POWs. Supposedly, someone, perhaps in a bar, suspected that maybe on one or other missions, the gunners might shoot those escorting fighters down and then scoot for home. And that supposedly happened in the Hundredth. It never did, and it has since been totally disproven, but because Captain Knox was not even in the area in which that was supposed to have happened. But that was one of the things on the mission that LeMay led that contributed to the myth and the legend of the Bloody Hundredth bomb group.
Amazing man, and we're obviously not going to get into his experience later in the war in the Pacific, but another amazing experience out there. But I reread parts of his biography. His first mission from Grafton Underwood with the 305th was to Nantes, to the sub pens, and he came up on that first mission with this idea of the initial point, the IP. Before that, the planes would duck and dive and move around to avoid the flak field. And when he saw that and understood that, he was like, well, how can we hit the target if we can't stay on a given line for more than 10 or 15 seconds? You can't be ducking and diving and moving around. Personally, I would have been ducking and diving and moving around, but he said, no, you just fly straight to the target from that initial point. And if it takes 3 or 4 minutes or 5 minutes, whatever. And he proved mathematically that you could fly through that flak field. And he came up with the number that it would take 272 flak shots to down a B-17. And it turned out to be pretty accurate. And after that, his group used that IP, and eventually it spread to the other groups as well, right? And then he was also the first guy to try what became known as the combat box, right? And this is a little hard to demonstrate. Lucky, I can show a picture of it here, maybe a little bit better. But Lucky, I noticed in the first and second episode, when they were in the operations room or the ready room or the debriefing room, they actually had models of B-17s on sticks, and that they were kind of illustrating where they were going to be in the combat box. It has to be authentic, because I'm sure Hanks and that crew wouldn't do anything like that unless it was authentic. Do you remember those models?
No, we did not have such models. It would have been
that
nice, perhaps we did, but this was not another of the theories that was developed, that in practice, on paper, it looked very good, but in practice, it didn't prove out to be quite as effective.
The
One
combat
of the things about this formation that it should be pointed out is that each airplane in that formation is flying at a slightly different altitude.
Right. That's what's hard to illustrate.
For each element of three, there's one airplane that is flying high, one in the lead, and one low, so that they're not exactly in line abreast, as it shows in that in those lower pictures, number three. And that proved to be far more effective because it kept some of the gunners from stitching other planes in the formation more likely than it did if they were flying in line abreast.
Yeah, yeah. And the idea was to mass those 11, 12 machine guns on each airplane in such a way to provide maximum protection, maximum firepower against the German fighters.
Yes, that was the theory again, that it could defend itself.
Yeah.
And practical, the practicality of it was that if you were to have a battle damage sufficiently to force you out of the formation and you had to make your way back singly, you were a dead duck.
Yeah.
You were just like a duck in a shooting gallery, because the Germans then would pick you off at leisure.
So this gets to the major point, and then I'm about done with this introductory sort of history. So at 1942 and 1943, when Lucky is there, 1943, we did not have fighter planes that could protect the bombers all the way to the deep targets in Germany and back. Had fighter planes that could protect into France and a little bit further at times, but we did not. Why did we not? Because that bomber doctrine out of the Bomber Mafia of daylight precision bombing was such that they thought we did not need fighter cover like that. And for all of 1942 and most of 1943, there is not that fighter cover. And that's part of the story as to what happened, especially in 43, as Lucky referenced these missions to Schweinfurt and other places where we lost, 10, 20, 30% of the planes. And a lot of that was because of the lack of fighter cover. Do I have that approximately real, Lucky?
Well, one of the things that I think was completely ignored was that the theory of fighter escort completely ignored the fact that the fighters, even when they could stay with us, were twice as fast as we were. And as a consequence, they had to orbit the formation in order to stay with us.
Yeah.
And be effective for any attacking force at all. And that burned up fuel very quickly. And they would have to retire and go back and refuel. And the Germans just simply laid back until they left. And then they proceeded to shoot the hell out of us.
Yeah.
Theoretically, another group of fighters would come in and rendezvous with the bomber force and pick up where the others had left off. But that didn't really work out very successfully very often. And as a consequence, most of the time, we flew unescorted. Period.
Yeah. Yeah. While you were there in 43, right? When it got into 44 and 45, that situation changed. And that's part of the story that I think will unfold, is that eventually fighter protection does come into play with the P-51 that could go all the way to Germany and back.
That is true, but then remember that when General Doolittle assumed the command of the 8th Air Force on January the 1st of 1944,
right,
he cut the escorts loose.
Right.
And said, take those signs down out of the ready room, that your mission is to escort the bombers.
Right.
It is no longer.
Right.
What you're to do is to go down and strafe the airfields of the Luftwaffe before they ever get off the ground. And that proved to be far more effective than we could possibly envision He was more visionary than we knew because we thought he was crazy. We thought that would be a death knell for us. But actually, it worked out far more successfully than the escorts trying to stay with us.
Yeah. Yeah. Todd, I see you put this poll up already. Todd, I'm not hearing you.
Yes, we've shared the poll, and I can give you the results if you like. Do you want me to take down your presentation here?
I tell you, there's just a couple more things I wanted to go into, and then I'll be done.
Okay.
So why can't I advance here? Here we are. The other thing that wasn't anticipated by the bomber strategy guys in the late 30s was radar. This is a German radar station, 1942, made by Telefunken. All right, and back in the late 30s and early 40s, radar was an experimental sort of stage, but hadn't been used tactically until the British used it and the RAF used it in the Battle of Britain in 1940 and proved its value, which of course the Germans picked up on and developed their own capabilities. So again, as soon as our planes took off in England and began to form, they could see that they were forming and they were coming to Europe, and eventually they could see in what direction they were going in. This is just a picture of, that's LeMay on the left, Hansel on the right. Hansel eventually gets promoted to be LeMay's boss. And in late 42 and early 43, the two of them clash about doctrine, about daylight precision bombing, about the box formation, about the IP. Hansel, to his credit, even though it was his doctrine, more or less, or at least he was one of the key players in it, to his credit, he eventually adapts all of Curtis LeMay's methodologies because he saw that they worked in reality rather than just the theory that was there, right? The other part of the LeMay Hansel story is the 20th Bomber Group of B-29s out in the Pacific later in the war, which Hansel is the commander first, and then LeMay relieves him. And that's another whole interesting story. There's a book called The Eagle and the Possum, the eagle being LeMay, the possum being Hansel. That is a fascinating book to read about that aspect. Okay. So my last two slides, I promise. I was a little bothered by the presentation in the episode about Colonel Harold Hoagland, if I have that name right. He was the commander of the 100th Bomb Group in June and July of 1943. He was the first combat commander. And they show him only making the first mission or so. And the portrayal of him, to me, seemed like he was kind of a weak commander, perhaps. And if you remember, for those of you that saw it, they show him having some stomach problems a couple of times, throwing up blood. And after the first mission, he throws up blood and he passes out. So I dug into this, and I could find absolutely nothing about that. Absolutely nothing. In fact, he's promoted to be a wing commander after he leaves the 100th. And in his place comes the very well-known and well-portrayed Colonel Nick Chick Harding.
Chick Harding.
Who, Lucky, I imagine you met him and knew him well.
I did know him well and served under him not only in England, but later back in the States when I was a member of the 8th Air Force headquarters in Fort Worth. Colonel Harding was still my boss. So I knew him pretty well and liked him. He was not a strong leader, but he didn't shun, he didn't cower or avoid any of the rough missions. It's just that it didn't work out that he led many of the really outstanding or terribly difficult missions.
Which, as Bomber Group Commander, he was not expected to be in the air for every mission.
Of course not.
Yeah. So here's the interesting twist, and then I'm done. As I read more and more about Chick Harding, he left command of the 100th Bomber Group in 1944, early 44, and he left because he was hospitalized for gallstones and sent back to the States. So that's the only reason they took him out of that, out of the combat command. And I'm kind of thinking, I can't wait to ask the screenwriter that they sort of conflated these two characters. But in my mind, frankly, a little bit to the negative side of Colonel Hulig, if I got that name right, because it kind of showed him as being a little sickly and a little weak, and we got to get rid of him, and we get this hard-nosed guy in. And I don't think that's the story at all. So we'll find out.
Myself.
Pardon,
I
Lucky?
doubt that.
Say that again, Lucky. I'm sorry.
I seriously doubt that as being true and accurate.
Yeah. It's just one of those dramatizations that have to be built into these stories because, it's got to be dramatic. And okay. So, Todd, what do we have here in our survey?
Well, let's take a look here at the survey. We have 60% of the respondents have seen Masters of the Air, the first two episodes. 40% have not. So 40% of the people on this program have not seen it. Of those who have seen it, the vast majority give it a thumbs up. 29 people give it a thumbs up. One person gives it a thumbs down. And then 4 people somewhere in the middle. And then we have the open-ended question, what did you like or dislike about it? Somebody said, love the cockpit scenes. The filming is great. I love that there were true experiences. Somebody said small, transition from Nebraska to Greenland was not done well. Amazingly realistic, the sheer terror of it, interaction of the key roles was great. Let's see, not Band of Brothers quality, somebody said. I've heard that a lot. So that's kind of a sampling of the responses.
Okay. Interesting. So let me kick this off, the next part of the program with putting Kevin Maurer on the spot. Kevin, you still with us?
I'm right here. Yep.
You've seen the first 2 episodes, I'm sure.
I have, yes.
What are your thoughts, your comments, the pros and cons of what you've seen?
I mean, I think it's good. I'm really taken with it because it sort of brings to life a lot of the things that Lucky told me. And, that's what I find most exciting. I thought the first episode, Lucky and I did a lot of work around giving the reader a sense of what it was like to get ready for a mission and then go on a mission. The spine of Damn Lucky, our book, is a mission that he flew on October 8th, 1943 over Bremen, of all places. And I think the first episode does a very good job of showing a lot of the things that we really leaned into. To me, though, Lucky was such a good storyteller that I'm more in tune now with the little nuanced stuff. Like for me, the scene I liked the most out of the 2 episodes was the pub scene where they get into the fight with the RAF. But what I love most about that scene, and I think most viewers will miss this, but Lucky will not, is Dale Dye is in that scene.
Oh.
And he's hitting on Egan's girlfriend. And remember, Egan gets the drinks and he says, by the way, that guy just had the clap.
Yeah.
Well, that's a key piece of Lucky's story. And if you didn't read Damn Lucky, you have no idea. You just think he's just being rude or just talking trash. But it's true. And it's one of the more interesting stories in the beginning of Damn Lucky. So when I saw that, I was beyond tickled by it because I knew the backstory. So in some ways, because of Lucky's generosity and his storytelling, and because I had the chance to tell this story with Lucky, I feel like I'm in on some of the inside jokes, and I kind of get what they're getting at. So that's sort of where I take a lot of my joy in watching the show.
Yeah. That's really an interesting story.
They made him a major, and he wasn't a major.
I noticed that too. I was going to ask you. That guy continues to stumble, right, and turn and like he's the guy that lands in a white suit and just stays out of the puddle. Like he's a major in the show now. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I noticed that too.
And they also put mustaches on several of the guys that didn't have mustaches.
Mm.
Yeah.
I found a number of really nitpicking liberties that they took to try to glamorize it a little bit. Another thing in the second episode was when they showed the Tuskegee Airmen who were never in the the England part of the war. They were only in the Mediterranean. And why they were introduced there to give them a little publicity, which I don't think was ill-deserved, but still, as far as accuracy of this story is concerned, they had no part to play in it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Lucky, I asked you a question before the audience was brought in. In the second episode, there's their mission to Trondheim, to the submarine pens at Trondheim, the 100th Bomber Group. They make it there without much issue. There's some flak over the target. One of the planes is hit, loses an engine right away, and eventually a second engine. They make the turn, they come back. There's just a modest amount of fighter resistance, not very much. But that plane then is slowing down dramatically and can't keep up with the formation. And in that sequence, it's decided by the commander of the bomber group, whoever the air commander was that day, to slow the whole formation down, to allow that wounded plane, if you will, to stay with the formation and make it back to, in that case, they made it back to Scotland. I really wondered if that could be true or not, that they would slow a whole bomber formation down to save one plane. Kind of like a Navy convoy, you know, when there's a Navy convoy out there, one boat gets a torpedo in it, they don't slow down the convoy for that one boat, that they just sail on. So is that accurate, Lucky? And did anything like that happen to you?
It is accurate, Glenn, to a limited degree. In other words, if the ship that's damaged is slowed down, then the whole formation can slow to a slight degree, maybe 5 miles an hour in airspeed. Any more than that, and they're going to stall out, or they're in danger of stalling out. So they don't dare slow up below a certain level, and so it's only true to a limited degree. I'll put it that way.
Okay. So that particular scene, I watched it again today because I wanted to make sure I got my facts right. They talk about slowing down to 130 miles an hour from 200.
No way.
No way. Yeah.
No, sir. Yeah. They could not slow to that degree, and that's 20 miles below their normal indicated airspeed. And if they slowed that much, then the whole formation is in jeopardy. And the Germans would recognize it instantly and make the most of it and kill.
Yeah, yeah. And Colin Heath, you're such an expert on a lot of these sort of questions. Your view on that particular scene?
Yeah, I'm not exactly an aficionado on the bombers as much as I am the fighters, but I thought it was a little unrealistic that you would put an entire formation in danger, slowing down over flak batteries and maybe fighter attacks for the sake of one aircraft, because I'd never heard of that. So,
yeah. Okay. Interesting. Now, I want everybody to note my esteemed colleague, Todd, on the screen, and that the makeup people have come in and put a fake mustache on them.
It's amazing what CGI can do, isn't it? I figured if they could I've always wanted to grow a mustache and I never can. So now's my chance.
So, listen, I have a dozen other questions I could ask Lucky about this episode relative to his experiences, but I don't want to dominate the whole conversation. Todd, are there questions from the audience, or is there anything in the chat room?
Oh, we have so much
Lucky or
chat,
Kevin?
so much chat and so much chatter. I do want to take a moment and remind people this is a Veterans Breakfast Club. We do this on Zoom and we do it also in person. We publish a magazine. We send it out free of charge to anybody who wants it. Please do visit veteransbreakfastclub.org. Get on our mailing list so you can get our quarterly magazine. We're about to put it in the mail. It should get to you in the next couple weeks. And feel free to join any of our other programs. You can see we have a very robust schedule in person and online. I also want to thank Tobacco Free Adagio Health, which sponsors this program and makes it possible. They provide health, wellness, and nutrition information here in Pennsylvania and in West Virginia. And their tobacco-free wing encourages people to quit smoking and helps to reduce the rates of tobacco use. They educate people about the hazards of vaping and tobacco, and they advocate for policies for healthier places to live, work, and play. You can learn more about what they do at tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org. And our new sponsor for 2024 that we're very excited about is UPMC for Life. We're very grateful for supporting this program and other programs like it. They can help you make sense of Medicare. They can get the answers and information you need as to how to choose the Medicare Advantage plan that's right for you. UPMC offers a wide range of affordable Medicare Advantage plans, and military veterans can save money and get more benefits with their Medicare plans. UPMC for Life has plans designed for veterans and by veterans, and you could view all your plan options and compare costs and learn more about the benefits available to you by going to UPMC for Life, by going to upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. That's upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. Okay, back to you, Glenn.
Well, any questions in the chat for Lucky or for Kevin that we should pose?
Oh man, let's see.
Would anybody like to raise their hand and ask?
Yeah, let's have people raise their hand if they want to make a comment or ask a question. Certainly, there's a lot to talk about with this Masters of the Air. And the next episode, or maybe next two episodes, come out tomorrow, Glenn?
One episode. Now it's one episode at a time.
Got it. Tony, we have Tony has his hand up and Brad has his hand up. Tony, you go first.
All right, awesome. Hey, it's great to meet Kevin and Lucky virtually. And I have a question for Lucky, maybe Kevin as well. In the miniseries, Egan and Cleveland are portrayed as kind of these crazy guys, right? Kind of these wild antics. I'd like to get your impression on that, Lucky. There seem to be a lot of serious people in the 100th as well. Did you think those antics helped create a kind of glue and a personality for that unit, or do you think it was just a giant distraction?
Well, actually, it proved to be something of a safety valve. As you can imagine, we were terribly focused on what we were there to do, and we were sticking our noses to the grindstone and going out as frequently as we possibly could, as the weather allowed us, and sticking our necks out. And one of the things that I would point out to you that does not happen in wartime is that when you lose a crew, when a crew goes down, there's no memorial, there's no funeral, there's no recognition of the fact that they're gone. You just have empty bunks, which you have to refill immediately with replacements. So it's a terribly maturing and bitter experience. We don't have time to grieve. We don't have time to even ponder what the loss of that particular crew is going to mean to the success of the whole outfit. And so you just go out and do your job and keep doing it and keep your nose to the grindstone. Many of the things that Glenn has talked about as far as the strategy of the bombing and the utilization of the bomber forces was all done behind the scenes. We were not privy as crewmen to any of that. we weren't aware that the British were strongly objecting to our going out in the daytime and advised against it. We were just guinea pigs. We were trying to prove a strategy that had been devised by the mafia, and they were convinced that it would work and wanted to prove that it could. But it was flawed. It was badly flawed. The concept of fighter escort was flawed. The concept of the Norden bomb site was flawed. It was a myth. Theoretically, it could drop a bomb within a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet in ideal conditions. But what you completely ignored was that a free-falling object from 5 miles up goes through all types of air currents, which will throw it off. And if you hit the target, it's an accident.
Brad Washabaugh.
Thank you. Great to have you aboard, Lucky. You know, in
Thank you.
watching the series, I see several scenes where they hurry the crews off for debrief almost immediately to gather intelligence. And that kind of leads me to my question, you know, as you were, the Bomber Command was devising these tactics and strategy, did they ever listen to the crews? Did they ever take suggestions? Did they ever hear from them what they thought was going right and what was going wrong? And another question I have is, with the flak batteries, why did we not try to avoid if they knew where they were, why couldn't you fly in a route that was out of their concentration, or perhaps obscure or attack the main concentrations of flak batteries to either divert or lessen the effects on the main effort of the bomber crews?
Well, those are good questions, Brad, and I don't blame you for wondering about them. Let me sort of address them in reverse order, though. As far as the anti-aircraft defenses of the German targets were concerned, Glenn alluded to the fact that the Germans developed radar, and they actually could send that to their anti-aircraft batteries, and the batteries could automatically calculate what our altitude and direction and all the other factors and compute that, and they were electronically fired. So that, but there was about a 25 or 35-second interval between the time that shell left the gun and the time it reached our altitude. And so in that period of time, if we deviated a half a degree or 1 degree, it was much more effective than our attempting to take evasive action individually. But if the formation leader was smart enough to just vary the direction slightly, it could throw the whole battery off. And that was much more effective than trying to dodge it, because as you know, if you zig, you probably should have zagged, and instead of flying away from it, you flew into it. But those were just some of the things that we had to contend with, and we were not able to. We were so bitterly cold, being unpressurized, that it was impeding our ability to function drastically. And we were sitting in that cold environment for 5 or 6 hours, and you were numb, and you were just acting on impulse and reflective action to counteract the dangers and the emergencies that you experienced. So it was just a matter of pure luck if you survived it, because all the conditions really were against you.
And the idea of trying to attack the flak batteries themselves, Brad asked me that question last week, and I made up an answer. The thought I had was, well, it's a matter of where you're going to put your resources. Could you have taken them out bombers from 30,000 feet trying to hit one particular piece of artillery is not very likely, given that target. And two, Colin, remind me, there were how many anti-aircraft guns lined up against our forces? 1,000 or something?
Well, around Bremen alone, there were over 800.
Yeah.
Some were in fixed flak towers, and others were movable. They were on rail cars or on trucks, and they could ship them around very effectively. So it was not it was somewhat of a moving target if you tried to zero in on it. And the fighters never did. The fighters up until the 1st of January in 44 were still supposed to stay with the formation. And so they were up at high altitude and with trying to stay with us. But they weren't down and strafing ground targets.
Colin, you were going to add something?
Yeah, the guy who developed the defensive flak belt was General Joseph Kamhuber. And he created the Kamhuber line. And Wolfgang Falk created the night fighter defenses. They worked together, and then Gatlin's day fighters, they overlapped and they put a plan together. They had over 6,800 flak guns from the German border to Belgium alone. So that was a lot of firepower.
Oh, immense. And actually our damage to our formation from flak was equal to that from fighters.
And by the way, just so you know, I interviewed General Kamhuber about his flak belt, and he said that the only thing he didn't do was tell Hitler to give him more flak guns. But he had, by the end of 44, he had 12,000, if I remember what he said, 12,500, give or take, flak guns. 6,200 were 88 millimeters, the rest were 105s and different calibers. And he said the radar got so good that they could fire and forget and let it control. All they had to do was load and then let the Himmelbett-Würzburg radar system take over. And then it got more effective. So Lucky's absolutely right. It was effective.
It was darn effective.
Lucky, I heard you say something that I was about to ask, and I'd like you to repeat it. That in terms of planes shot down, planes heavily damaged, about 50% came from flak and 50% came from fighters. Is that what you said?
Most of the time during the war, that was true. It varied pretty widely, depending upon once the invasion after D-Day. That would have been less true, I think, than before D-Day. But up until D-Day, that was certainly the case, and that's while I was there.
Right. In fact, Joe Peterburs, are you still with us? And Ed Cottrell. I know, Joe, when we interviewed you, and you were a P-51 pilot, but as I recall, you didn't have too many opportunities to shoot down German planes because by late 44 and 45, there just weren't that many German fighters around for you to shoot down.
Well, that's correct. I mean, it wasn't the heyday of the 43 and early 44, but there were still plenty of fighters, and then the 262 came in, and that was really devastating. And when I arrived in November, we had already had encounters with 262, and the general thing was we had fighter sweeps, we had designated ground targets, but most of my missions were with escorting. And our group, we had to escort the bombers to the target. If there's no activity, enemy activity, then a squadron would be released to hit targets of opportunity.
Right.
Well, Joe, did you also encounter the jets?
Oh, yes, yes, several
They
times.
started, they invented the jet, and you had to cope with those.
Yeah, on the day I was shot down, they had, I think there were 55 262s uh, uh, in the general area that we were bobbing in. Of course, the formations were, I mean, I'm talking about 1,200 bombers being escorted by 900 fighters. And when one of my missions, I think it was my 11th, it was we got hit by about 400 ME-109s and 190s. And it was just mayhem. There were dog fights from Berlin down to Wittenberg. And then bombers blowing up, parachutes in the air. I was more concerned about hitting debris in the air than I was the other fires. I had a head on with a 109. But anyway, it was we had some active stuff, and I went over with 7 guys, and we had 100% casualty. So talk about the end of the war. We're still getting killed. There were 3 of us that became POWs, and there were 4 killed in action, 5 killed in action, who were killed in training.
Joe,
Hey,
thank
I
you,
see
Joe.
Joe
Yes.
McCarthy. We have another Joe. Joe McCarthy, good to see you. I haven't seen you in a long time. Your father was a member of a B-17 crew with the 8th Air Force. You asked an interesting question in the chat.
Yes. Good evening, Lucky. It's an honor to talk to you. My dad flew in the 91st Bomb Group aboard Ack Annie in the 322nd Squadron. Told me stories about flying missions over Germany and having bombs get hung up in the bomb bay. And his captain, Charlie Bratcher, radioed him to kick them out. That's what the phrase he used. So my question was, Lucky, how often did that ever happen on any of your missions? And if so, how did you remedy that? And then just to follow up, what was your relationship like with flight engineers? They were right behind you, standing throughout the mission. Just a little insight to that, please. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you for your dad's service. And certainly we did experience iced up bomb shackles, which refused to release the bombs when they were triggered. And I'll never forget that the lead bombardier of one of the missions, who was a major, a bombardier, was brought up before the entire wing by General LeMay. And he said, "Major, I want you to explain why you missed the target." And he said, "Well, sir, unfortunately, my bombs hung up. And the shackles iced up." And he said, "Do you mean that you knew you were going to fly this mission the day before? You didn't test those at altitude?" "No, sir." And he said, "Well, Major, you're a liar. You missed the target by 9 miles short. And if your bombs hung up, you would have missed it 9 miles long. Sit down, Lieutenant."
Man,
Oh my gosh.
He
Curtis never
busted
told
him
me that
2
one.
grades on the spot.
Whoa.
Wow.
Ed Cottrell, I know that you've been patiently waiting. Good to see you, Ed.
I just wanted to make one comment in conjunction with the P-51. If everybody remembers that on January the 1st, the Luftwaffe practically disappeared from existence because they hit every air base and took a tremendous loss. And from there on, I don't think the 51 pilots had as much problem. I know we didn't see the ME-109s and the Focke-Wulfs after that. Flak was our biggest problem.
Right. Right. And I mean, and your missions were ground support, tactical.
Right. Our
support
missions
of
were
people.
not flying escort for the bombers. But I think Lucky might know if there was a bigger, a less frequency of Luftwaffe after January 1st than before.
January 1st of 44 or 45?
Right. 45.
45. Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry I wasn't there in 45.
Okay. Sorry.
I completed my tour in February of 44.
Okay.
So
I would have
with
thought,
the
Lucky, you
original
were.
group when it went overseas, and I finished up in early 44. But
I'd have
40,
thought you'd have been happy you weren't there, Lucky, and 40
Yeah.
by then.
I was
Lucky,
happy, and I was back in the States.
Joe asked another question that you didn't get to, Lucky, and that was the relationship you had with the engineer who stood right behind the pilot and co-pilot.
Oh yes, I'm sorry I ignored that, because usually the flight engineer or the top turret gunner was the guy that if the bombs hung up or if there was any difficulties or injuries in the back of the airplane, he was the guy that had to go and render first aid or kick the bombs out, or he was responsible for transferring all of the fuel from tanks to tanks to equalize our stability and center of gravity. So he was the most important non-com on our crew, and we had usually great respect for him. I had great respect for the ones that I flew with, as I did also for the crew chiefs on the ground, who were the ones who had to patch up the airplanes after we brought them back all shot to hell and get them airworthy by the next morning, despite the fact they had to do it in the dark, in the rain, and under flashlights. And they worked all night long, and they really considered each airplane their baby. So they highly resented our bringing it back all shot up, but very unflinchingly did everything in their power to get it back and make it airworthy by the next morning for the next day's flight.
I was really pleased that in the first two episodes, they highlighted actually some of those ground crews and the work they did.
Rightfully
I
so.
thought that was very interesting. So someone has their hand up.
Yes, we have Carol Wagoner, and then I want to go to Rona. Carol, you've been waiting patiently also. Carol from California, author of The Hardest Year with her husband, William. How are you?
We're great. We live not far from the Hancock Airfield, where they trained a lot of pilots. It was one of 8 civilian institutions. And there's very little history in the area, but I guess 4 were Doolittle pilots, and 1 was the man from Unbroken, the movie. But where did most of the World War II pilots actually train? What states or areas? Anyone know?
Texas. Nearly everyone that went in the Air Force at some point trained in Texas. They had more airfields, more training fields, and it was in the middle of the country, so it was the safest. That was, and ironically, I grew up in Tennessee, and I never set foot in Texas until I came home. And then they sent me to the instrument pilot school to learn to fly instruments. I said, good God, I needed that before I went to England, not after.
And were some of your teachers actually women? I've read books about the women that were training our pilots.
Yes.
Many of them were women, right?
There were, and they were in Texas.
And how did you like that? Was that okay?
California had a good many airfields as well, but I think if you really portioned it out and researched it carefully, you'd find that nearly everyone that's in the Air Corps at that time went through some field in Texas.
Great. Did some of those women trainers date the students they were training?
I think they're
I
trying to get.
don't know that they did, but I wouldn't doubt it.
Thank you.
It actually is a fascinating story about the logistics of building an Air Force. And Don Miller goes into this in his book, Masters of the Air. 1939, we had 1,200 planes, and I'm going to guess 25,000 personnel in the Army Air Corps, right? 1943, we've got worldwide, not just Europe, 40,000 planes and 400,000 or 500,000 men. Eventually, the Army Air Corps comes to be 1/3 of the total Army, right? The Army grows to be about 8 million men at its highest point. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Maybe it's more like 7 million men.
16 million.
Well, 16 million in total.
under arms.
16 million in total under arms.
Yes.
In the U.S. Army Air Force, about 2.3 million. The U.S. Army Air Force is about 1/3 of the Army. So you think about the growth that took and the logistics and the administration of all that training and all those bases. It truly was, one of the production miracles of the American economy. There was someone else with the hand up.
Well, there's Rona and there's Dave then. Rona?
Sure. Thank you so much, Todd, and everyone for putting this on. Lucky, it is an incredible privilege to speak with you. My father-in-law was a B-17 pilot who flew until June 44. One of those who did not finish his tour, which is the topic of my book. But what I really wanted to ask in this, in the series, I noticed that, and I don't know whether it was Crosby or Kurt, and I still haven't figured all so many characters in here. The navigator on the plane is shown, of course, being ill, but it's not knowing Crosby where they were. And I thought that was incredibly strange that when they initially flew and ended up in France, he had no idea where they were. Granted, he's nervous. He comes over there. It's his first flight. But later on, when they're flying on one of the missions, he still is sort of at a loss for where they are. And I thought that was awfully weak. I don't know if that was true to, and I don't know whether they're building to relieve him of his duty or not, but I thought that was strange that the pilot would have tolerated somebody not in his capacity, not knowing where they were.
Well, we had a navigator on each crew, as you know, and the lead navigator of the formation was the only one that really needed to navigate as long as the formation was intact. But each navigator should have been following him and known where their position was, so that if they got shot out of the formation, that he could give his pilot heading back to home base, and that was their job. They didn't always perform it, and they weren't always that up to the minute on what their position was, but they also had a gun that they could handle, as did the bombardier, and it was hit and miss as to whether or not they were attending to their knitting and following the progress of the formation, so that if needed, they could come up with the right answer to their pilot on an instant's notice. But that didn't always happen.
Thank you so much.
I think that to some extent in the series, they're trying to illustrate using that navigator who is Crosby and becomes the lead navigator for the 100th. I think they're trying to illustrate how little training some of these men had. And especially, it's one thing to navigate from Toledo, Ohio to Pittsburgh. It's a whole nother thing to navigate in those kind of conditions at 30,000 feet, 40 degrees below zero, with all these people shooting at you. And you know, I think there's a line in this one of the scenes where Crosby says something like, you know, 9 months ago I was still in college, and now he's a navigator trying to navigate formations across, you know, a battleground. So
These were kids.
yeah, that's the other point. They were kids.
Yeah.
Well, we were very much kids and very immature and gullible, and I'm very interested to see whether or not this series is going to document the fact that 40 of my classmates and me from flying school were taken directly to Kearney, Nebraska, and replaced all the co-pilots in the group. And we'd never been in a B-17. So it's one thing for a navigator or a bombardier not to be thoroughly trained in their trade. For co-pilots, not to have ever been in a B-17 before, he's second in command of the crew. And if for any reason the pilot's incapacitated, he has to take over. And the only training that we got before we went overseas was from our pilot as to how to fly the airplane, how complicated it was to fly 4 engines. We'd only flown 2-engine trainers, and this seriously impaired the integrity of each individual crew in the 100th Bomb Group. And that never happened in any other group. And nobody has ever explained why that was done, because it was absolutely ridiculous. And it put us all in jeopardy. And I remember that the commanding officer then, who was Turner, called us up and he said, now look to your right and you look to your left, and only one of you is coming home. Yeah. So you're going to be killed, and you might as well accept it. And that's the way we went to war.
Well, I'll fly with you any day, Lucky.
You bet.
Chills down my back.
Chills down. Yeah. Colonel Seaver, how are you tonight?
I'm well. How are you?
Good.
First, I just want to say, man, what an honor it is to have not only Lucky, but the other 2 gentlemen, the pilots, you know, because there's so few of our World War II heroes left. So what a great honor to be able to interact with these gentlemen. Just 2 things, because there was a question about training fields. You know, they had them all over the Western United States. I grew up, you know, in Idaho, just a few miles from Gowan Field, where Jimmy Stewart actually did some training. And a couple of the old hangar buildings are still there and still in use today. So there's that. But I wanted to ask Lucky, because we give all the glory to the P-47s and the P-51s, but we forget that there were also P-38s in the theater and that they also did escort missions. So I just wanted to ask if you ever had the P-38 squadrons that escorted the missions. I know the Germans didn't like them. They had a bad name for them.
Unfortunately, there were too few of them, and we never saw them. They did not ever escort our group or our wing. And you probably are aware that the P-38 at high altitude over Europe did not function as efficiently as it did in the Pacific. It was far more effective as a fighter and a fighter bomber in the Pacific theater, but than it was in the European theater war.
Right. Yeah. I know they had the Allison engines, which just didn't do well at altitude. So
that's true.
But they had all that firepower packed in the nose, so they had quite a punch when they hit something.
Well, they did, and they were very much feared by the Luftwaffe. But still, they were not that effective, and there weren't as many of them. We had only, I think, a couple of squadrons of P-38s in the entire theater while I was there. Now, there may have been more that were added at a later date, but not while I was experiencing combat.
Hey, Phil, you are going to have the last question or comment. How are you?
Todd, there's someone else been holding. Oh yeah, Phil. Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know
Hi,
which one is Phil. Could be Phyllis or could be Philip. I don't know.
I'm the comments for me. I'm Marjorie Thompson Ziegler, and my dad was with the 392nd B-24 group out of England. So thank you, Lucky. It's really exciting to meet you and all you veterans. I just wanted to comment, like sometimes for non-military families, there's a wonderful 8th Air Force Museum in Poole, Georgia. You are also able to retrieve family records there, of your parent who served in the service. I was able to retrieve every flying mission my dad was on and bring it home to him and share with him that the one flight he got scrubbed because of a high fever. Everyone in that crew was able to jump out except for one, which was probably the pilot who went down with the plane. And he never knew that. So, you find out amazing things when you start doing the research in the history. So, thank you. Anything else? Yeah.
That is the 8th Air Force in Savannah, Georgia?
Right. Yeah. The museum, I think, is
The museum.
Mighty 8th Air Force.
It's right outside. It's on the border. It's on the border.
It's actually just outside of Savannah in Poole, where I've been a couple of times.
It's
Poole
wonderful.
Community, just right off of 95.
Yeah. And
Right.
when somebody else was asking a question, when my dad came home, he taught in Carlsbad, New Mexico for a while. He was training the next generation of bombardier navigators. So that was another airfield where training occurred. But this was later in the war. It's probably 44, around there, because he was there 43 to about 44 in England. So that's it.
Boy, oh boy. Are you a Navy vet, Margaret?
No, my husband is. He did his 20 in the Navy.
Okay, got it. Well, thank you for joining us, Margaret and Phil. I appreciate that. Man, what an exhilarating program. Glenn, I mean, I think that's the word that I'm using. This is exhilarating, having this conversation, and so much back and forth in the chat and question and answer. Glenn, I'm looking at the clock. It's past 8:30. Do you have any final thoughts?
Well, wonderful program, Lucky. It's an honor to have you on. Thank you very much. You're so generous with your time. Kevin, same, 2 weeks in a row. Appreciate your generosity. And of course, our other two World War II veterans we have, Joe and Ed. Thank you very much. It's an honor to have you. And thanks for everybody. Next week, well, of course, tomorrow night is the 3rd episode of Masters of the Air. Right. So we'll be watching that. And then next week we'll be talking about it. And next week our sort of expert guest is Rob Ellers, who we had on the panel last week. Rob is a veteran himself, an Air Force veteran in intelligence. And he's written several books. One of them is called Targeting Berlin. No.
The Third Reich.
Targeting Germany, sorry. Which I'm about 3/4 of the way through down here at the pool. And it's really an in-depth analysis of how the intelligence behind the bombers, the part of it, Lucky, that you never got to see, how they picked which targets they were going to, how often they were going to, where they should have gone, where they would like to have gone, the interplay with the British intelligence. He's a greatly knowledgeable man and very intelligent. And then Colin Heaton, who is on with us tonight, he's also going to be on with us one night a little bit later this month. I haven't set up that date with you yet, Colin, but I'm soon to do that. So every week we're going to do this till the episode's end, and then we'll probably go beyond it too. So thank you everybody for being with us.
Hey, have a great weekend. Have a great long weekend. Thank you all for joining us. Hope to see you next week. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank